In the bitter cold of November 1883, deep in Montana Territory, near what would later become the town of Lewistown, a homesteader named Thomas Morgan became the subject of considerable mockery throughout the scattered community. Word had spread among the neighbouring claims that Morgan was building his chimney sideways, running it horizontal along the inside of his cabin wall, before finally turning it upward through the roof. His nearest neighbour, a gruff cattleman named William Hendricks, who lived about 3 miles northeast, as the crow flies, made no secret of his opinion on the matter. Cold enough to see your breath inside most frontier cabins come December, and here was Morgan wasting precious resources on what Hendricks called fool's architecture. The other settlers within a day's ride agreed. Everyone knew a chimney went straight up. That was how chimneys worked. That was how they had always worked. But Morgan had seen something they hadn't. And by the time the brutal winter of 1884 would arrive, bringing temperatures cold enough to freeze a man's spit before it hit the ground, that sideways chimney would prove the difference between desperate survival and relative comfort. Thomas Morgan had come to Montana Territory 2 years earlier from Pennsylvania, where he'd worked as a stonemason's apprentice in his youth before trying his hand at farming. The work had been hard but predictable there, the winters cold but manageable. He'd headed west after his wife passed from fever, leaving behind 2 grown sons who had their own farms to tend. Montana promised a fresh start, and he'd claimed 160 acres in a sheltered valley where Flat Willow Creek ran through stands of cottonwood and willow. The land was good, the water reliable, and he'd built himself a solid cabin using lodgepole pine from the surrounding hills. The nearest settlement of any size was Fort McGinnis, about 15 miles south, where a small garrison kept watch over the territory. Closer by were scattered homesteads like his own, families and solitary men trying to carve out something lasting from the unforgiving land. Most of them built their cabins the traditional way, with a stone or clay fireplace and chimney running straight up one wall, just as their fathers and grandfathers had done back east. But Morgan had noticed something during his first winter in that cabin, something that gnawed at him through the long, frozen months. The heat from his fire seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it was produced. He'd wake in the night, the fire still burning strong, and yet the cabin would be barely warmer than the frozen air outside. He could see the glow of the coals, feel the warmth if he stood directly in front of the hearth. But 3 paces away, the cold pressed in like something alive. He went through cord after cord of firewood, more than he'd calculated he'd need, more than seemed reasonable for a cabin of that size. His hands were constantly raw from splitting logs, his back aching from hauling them inside. He'd watched the smoke rise straight up the chimney, and realized he was watching his heat leave too. All that precious warmth, generated from hours of labour cutting and splitting wood, was being pulled up and out into the night sky, while he shivered under every blanket he owned. The traditional design was wasting the very thing he needed most. He started thinking about how a man might capture some of that escaping heat, how he might make the warmth work for him before it vanished forever into the cold. By the spring thaw, Morgan had worked out an idea in his mind. He'd watched how the metal stove in the trading post at Fort McGinnis heated the whole room, and he realized it wasn't just about the fire itself, but about the metal holding and radiating that heat outward. He thought about how a root cellar stayed cool in summer, because it was dug deep, surrounded by earth that held temperature. He started imagining a chimney that didn't just carry smoke away, but held onto heat, radiating it back into the cabin before finally releasing the smoke outside. A chimney that ran horizontal, giving the hot stone or clay time to warm the air around it, before eventually turning upward to draw properly. When he tried to explain this to William Hendricks one afternoon in late May, the cattleman had looked at him like he'd lost his senses. Hendricks said a chimney needed to go straight up to draw. That was basic common sense. He said Morgan would fill his cabin with smoke and probably burn the whole thing down. He said it loud enough that others heard, and by the time Morgan started gathering materials that summer, most of the valley knew about his strange plan and thought him touched by too much solitude. Morgan felt the weight of their skepticism every time he rode into Fort McGinnis for supplies. Men would nod politely, but their eyes said they thought him a fool. Women would ask after his health, implying that grief had perhaps clouded his judgment. Even the younger homesteaders, men his own son's ages, who might have been expected to welcome innovation, shook their heads and advised him to stick with proven methods. The isolation grew heavier. He'd never been a particularly social man, but now he found himself avoiding the occasional gatherings, the shared barn raisings, the Sunday services held in a homesteader's cabin when the circuit preacher came through. He began to doubt himself in the quiet hours, wondering if they were right, if he was wasting an entire summer's effort on something that would fail spectacularly. His sons sent letters urging him to build proper, to not take foolish risks so far from help. But Morgan remembered those frozen nights, remembered the endless labour of feeding a fire that couldn't keep him warm, and he pressed on. He'd always trusted his observations more than tradition, even when it set him apart. By early August, Morgan had collected what he needed. He'd cut clay from the creek bank, good dense clay that held together when wetted and dried hard as stone in the sun. He'd gathered river rocks, about as many as a wagon could carry in 2 trips, smooth stones worn round by water, each about the size of a man's fist or larger. He'd traded for lime at the fort, 3 full sacks that cost him most of his spring trapping earnings, to make proper mortar that wouldn't crumble with heat. The work began in the heat of late summer, when a man could labour outdoors without his hands going numb. He started by carefully dismantling his old chimney, salvaging what stone he could. Then he began building the new design, from the hearth outward. The firebox itself remained much as before, but where the chimney would normally rise straight up, Morgan instead built it to run horizontally along the cabin's north wall. He constructed it thick, using double layers of stone and clay, making the whole structure about as wide as a man's shoulders, and tall enough that it came up to his waist. He built it to run nearly the full length of that wall, about as far as a man might throw a stone with good effort, before finally turning upward at a sharp angle through the roof. The construction was slow, deliberate work. Each stone had to be set carefully, the mortar mixed to just the right consistency, thick enough to hold, but not so thick it would crack when heated. Morgan worked alone mostly, though occasionally a curious neighbour would stop by, ostensibly to water their horse, but really to see the progress of what they considered a doomed project. He'd hear them muttering to each other about the waste of good stone and clay. He'd catch them shaking their heads at the horizontal run, so contrary to every chimney they'd ever seen. The structure took shape over several weeks, and with each day's progress, the criticism seemed to grow louder. William Hendricks rode over one afternoon in September, watched Morgan working for a time, then said straight out that he was building a smoke trap that would either suffocate him or burn his cabin down. And either way, it would serve as a lesson to others about the dangers of thinking yourself smarter than your forefathers. Morgan didn't argue. He just kept working, pressing clay into gaps, smoothing mortar with hands that knew the feel of stone from his youth. By late September, As the aspen leaves turned gold in the high country, Morgan had completed his sideways chimney. The structure ran along the inside of his cabin wall like a long, low bench, its surface smooth clay and stone, the horizontal section perhaps 15 feet in length before the sharp turn upward. He'd left the last section of roof open, waiting to see if the draft would work, before sealing everything permanently. The entire community waited too, though with different expectations. Most figured they'd see smoke pouring out his windows, and or come the first cold morning he tried to use it. Some made bets at the trading post about how long it would take Morgan to tear it down and rebuild properly. A few of the women, kinder in their concern, wondered if he'd make it through winter at all without proper heat, being alone as he was with no family nearby to take him in when his foolish experiment failed. Morgan himself felt the pressure of all those watching eyes, all that certainty that he was wrong. But he'd seen too many men freeze for want of heat, burned too much wood for too little warmth, to believe the old way was the only way. The first test came on a cool morning in early October, the kind of morning where frost silvered the grass and a man's breath made clouds in the air. Morgan built a small fire in the hearth, using just kindling and a few split logs, and watched the smoke. For the first several minutes his heart sank, as smoke did indeed begin to seep back into the room, swirling lazily near the ceiling. He could hear Hendrix's words in his head, hear all their predictions of failure. But he'd expected this, had understood that the chimney needed to warm before it would draw properly. He opened the door and the window, letting fresh air flow through, and kept the fire small and steady. After perhaps a quarter hour, he noticed the smoke beginning to move more decisively toward the horizontal section. After half an hour, it was drawing cleanly, pulled through the long channel and up the vertical section into the open air. He closed the door and window. The smoke continued to rise properly, no longer spilling into the cabin. The chimney was working as he'd hoped. But the real test wasn't about smoke. It was about heat. Morgan added more wood to the fire, building it up to a strong working blaze, the kind of fire he would have kept burning through a cold night. He moved around the cabin, feeling the air at different distances from the hearth. What he noticed made him pause with something like wonder. Near the firebox itself, the heat was intense as always, but now there was something more. The entire horizontal section of the chimney was growing warm to the touch, radiating heat outward like a massive iron stove. He could feel warmth spreading through the cabin in a way he'd never experienced with his old straight chimney. He placed his hand on the stone surface 3 feet from the fire and found it warm enough to be uncomfortable. He moved further along, perhaps 10 feet from the hearth, and the stone was still noticeably warm, still pushing heat into the room. The whole structure was acting like a storage bank for the fire's energy, capturing what would have simply rushed up a vertical chimney and been lost. By afternoon, with the fire burning steadily, the entire cabin was warm enough that he removed his outer coat, something he rarely did in his old setup, even with a roaring fire. He used perhaps half the wood he normally would have, maybe less, to achieve noticeably more warmth. Over the next few weeks, as October gave way to November and the cold deepened, Morgan continued his observations. He found that once the stone mass of the horizontal chimney warmed fully, which took a few hours with a good fire, it would stay warm for a long time after the fire died down. He could let the fire reduce to coals overnight, something he'd never dared with his old chimney, and wake to a cabin that was cool but not freezing, the stone still radiating stored warmth. He was using roughly half the firewood he'd burned the previous winter, maybe even less than that. and staying considerably warmer in the process. When he rode over to Hendricks's place in mid-November to help with some fence repair, he noticed immediately how cold the man's cabin was, despite the large fire burning in the traditional fireplace. Hendricks had his family bundled in layers, the children sitting close to the hearth, frost still visible on the inside of the windows. Morgan didn't say anything, but he saw Hendricks notice that Morgan himself wore only a single coat, that his hands weren't chapped and raw from endless wood splitting. The reason the design worked was simpler than Morgan could have explained in scientific terms, but he understood it in the practical way of a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life. A traditional chimney was like wearing just a shirt in winter. It did something, but most of your body's warmth escaped into the air around you. The horizontal chimney was like wearing layers, like the way a buffalo hide coat worked better than thin cloth. The smoke and heat from the fire had to travel the full length of that stone structure before escaping outside, and all along that journey the stone absorbed the heat, held it, and radiated it back into the cabin. It was the same principle that made a blacksmith's forge work, or how the bricks behind a bakery oven stayed warm long after the fire died. The mass of stone acted like a reservoir, storing heat that would otherwise be wasted. The horizontal design gave the stone time to capture that heat before it could escape. Think of it like trying to warm your hands over a candle versus wrapping your hands around a hot stone. The candle's warmth passes right through and is gone. The stone holds the warmth and gives it back slowly. Morgan's chimney was essentially a very large, very heavy hot stone running the length of his cabin, constantly being heated on one end by the fire, constantly radiating that captured warmth into the air around it. As winter approached in earnest, the older homesteaders began reading the signs. The beavers were building their dams higher than usual, piling more mud and branches than anyone could remember seeing. The elk came down from the high country earlier than normal, moving into the valleys while the weather was still moderate. Birds that usually lingered were gone by early November. The cattlemen who'd lived in Montana Territory for years spoke in low voices about what was coming. They'd seen winters that could kill cattle by the hundreds, freeze entire herds standing in their tracks. They'd seen timber wolves come down to homesteads in broad daylight, driven by hunger. The Blackfoot and Crow, who traded at Fort McGinnis, were stocking their camps heavily, taking extra hides and dried meat. Old-timers spoke of the winter of 1876, when men froze to death just yards from their own cabins, unable to see through the blizzard to find their doors. By late November, the sky had taken on a peculiar flat grey quality, and the temperature began to drop in a way that felt deliberate, steady, like the land itself was preparing for siege. The storm began on the 5th of December, starting with snow that fell thick and heavy, the flakes large as a man's palm. Within hours, it was falling so dense you couldn't see from the cabin to the barn, maybe 20 paces at most. The wind came up from the north, driving and bitter, cold enough to take your breath away and make your lungs ache. The snow piled against Morgan's cabin, drifting up past the windows on the north side, burying the lower half of his door. He kept his fire burning steadily, feeding it split pine and dead cottonwood, and watched as his sideways chimney did exactly what he'd hoped it would. The cabin stayed warm, genuinely warm, warm enough that he could sit at his table in his shirt sleeves and write in his journal. The horizontal stone mass radiated heat like a living thing. He ran his hand along it sometimes, feeling the warmth stored there, heat that would have been wasted up a conventional chimney. Meanwhile, across the valley and scattered throughout the territory, his neighbors were fighting for survival in their traditional cabins. William Hendricks and his family were burning through their woodpile at an alarming rate, feeding log after log into their straight chimney just to keep the cabin barely above freezing. The children huddled together for warmth, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Hendricks's wife had moved their bedrolls as close to the fireplace as she dared, afraid the children would suffer frostbite in the night. Despite a fire that roared constantly, that consumed wood faster than Hendricks could split it, the cabin remained desperately cold. Frost formed on the inside walls. Water left in a cup overnight would be frozen solid by morning. The family wore their heavy coats indoors, slept in their boots, and still woke shivering. Hendricks himself was exhausted from the constant labour of hauling wood, splitting it in the brutal cold, feeding the insatiable fire. He'd look at his dwindling woodpile, calculate how many more days the storm might last, and feel genuine fear for his family's survival. Other families faced the same struggle, the same desperate mathematics of wood consumption versus heat retention. The storm lasted 9 days without pause. 9 days of wind that howled like something sentient, temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, snow that piled higher than a tall man could reach. The 6th day was the worst, when the temperature plummeted further still, and the wind reached velocities that tore shingles from roofs and collapsed poorly built structures. On that day, with his family's situation growing desperate, William Hendricks made the decision to take his youngest child, a boy of 5, who'd been coughing badly and felt fever-hot to the touch despite the cold, and fight his way through the storm to Thomas Morgan's cabin. He knew it was 3 miles through whiteout conditions. He knew he might not make it, but he also knew that staying in his own cabin, burning through the last of his wood while his son grew sicker, was a slower form of the same risk. He bundled the boy against his chest, wrapped them both in buffalo hide, and pushed out into the storm. It took Hendricks nearly 4 hours to cover those 3 miles, following the creek bed when he could find it, feeling his way forward when he couldn't see at all. His face was numb, his legs exhausted from breaking through chest-deep drifts. The boy had stopped crying an hour in, had gone quiet in a way that terrified his father. When Hendricks finally saw the dim shape of Morgan's cabin through the blowing snow, saw smoke rising from the chimney, he could have wept with relief. He pounded on the door with fists he could barely feel. Morgan opened it quickly, pulled them both inside, and Hendricks felt the warmth hit him like a physical force. It was warm, genuinely, impossibly warm. Warm enough that Morgan stood in his shirt sleeves. Warm enough that the frost in Hendricks's beard began to melt and drip immediately. The cabin was as warm as any house back east, as warm as the trading post on a summer day, and the fire in Morgan's hearth wasn't even particularly large. Hendricks set his son down near the long stone structure that ran along the wall, and the boy instinctively pressed himself against it, drawn to its radiated warmth. Morgan brought blankets, hot coffee for Hendricks, warm broth for the child. As Hendricks thawed, as feeling returned painfully to his hands and feet, he couldn't stop looking at that sideways chimney. He reached out and touched the stone surface. It was warm, solidly warm, all along its length. He looked at the modest fire in the hearth, then at the comfortable temperature of the cabin, and understanding dawned. He'd been wrong. They'd all been wrong. This wasn't fool's architecture. This was wisdom they'd been too blind to recognize. Morgan said nothing, just tended to his neighbors, gave them warmth and shelter. But in that moment, with his son warming beside that innovative chimney, with comfort surrounding him that his own traditional setup could never have provided, Hendricks felt humility settle over him more heavily than any storm. The storm finally broke on the 10th day, leaving the Montana Territory buried under drifts that reshaped the landscape. When neighbors could finally move between claims again, word spread quickly about Hendricks's experience in Morgan's cabin. Men came to see the sideways chimney for themselves, to feel the warmth it radiated, to understand what they'd mocked. By late December, before the snow had fully melted from the valley floor, 2 other homesteaders had begun dismantling their traditional chimneys. By the following spring, nearly every cabin within a day's ride of Morgan's place was being modified or rebuilt with horizontal chimneys. The design spread from homestead to homestead, carried by men who'd survived that brutal winter and learned the difference between tradition and wisdom. Some built theirs exactly as Morgan had. Others experimented with variations, making them longer or shorter, trying different materials for the horizontal run. But the basic principle remained, that understanding that heat was too precious to waste, that stone could hold and share warmth if given the chance. Morgan's own chimney served his cabin for another 23 years, until he passed in the winter of 1906. An old man by frontier standards, warm in the home he'd built with his own innovation. The cabin stood for several more years after that, used by a succession of families, before eventually being abandoned as the frontier era gave way to modern settlement. But the principle Morgan had proven, that heat could be captured and used more efficiently through thoughtful design, had already spread far beyond his valley. You'd find variations of the sideways chimney throughout Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakota Territories, wherever homesteaders shared knowledge and learned from each other's survival strategies. The specific design faded as modern heating made such innovations less necessary, but the story remained, passed down as an example of how observation and persistence could challenge convention and save lives. It became the kind of tale old-timers would share with newcomers, a reminder that not all wisdom came from tradition, that sometimes the solution to suffering was right there, if you were willing to see differently. Looking back at Thomas Morgan's journey from mockery to vindication, from isolation to quiet respect, there's something profound about the pattern it reveals. He wasn't an educated man, had no formal training in engineering or thermodynamics. He was simply someone who paid attention, who noticed inefficiency and refused to accept it as inevitable, who trusted his observations even when everyone around him insisted he was wrong. The winter of 1884 could have killed him for his unconventional thinking, but instead it proved him right in the most dramatic way possible. His neighbors had every reason to be skeptical. Chimneys had been built the same way for generations, and survival on the frontier wasn't a place for risky experiments. But Morgan understood something they didn't, at least not yet. He understood that inherited wisdom wasn't always complete wisdom, that there was space between respecting tradition and being bound by it. The brutal test of that winter didn't just validate a chimney design. It validated a way of thinking, a willingness to question and innovate even under the hardest circumstances imaginable. What makes his story resonate beyond its specific historical moment is how universal its pattern remains. Innovation often looks like foolishness until it's proven. The person who sees something others miss, who proposes an unconventional solution, frequently faces ridicule before they face respect. Community consensus isn't the same as truth, and sometimes the wisest course is the lonely one. Morgan's sideways chimney worked because he understood, in practical terms any pioneer could grasp, that heat was a resource too valuable to waste. that capturing and storing it was worth the effort of unconventional construction. He proved that survival often demanded adaptation, not just endurance. His story reminds us that progress frequently comes from ordinary people solving immediate problems with available resources, not from distant experts imposing solutions from above. The frontier demanded innovation because failure meant death, and that urgency stripped away the luxury of clinging to tradition simply because it was familiar. These stories of frontier ingenuity, of men and women solving impossible problems with whatever they had at hand, deserve to be remembered and shared. They represent a kind of practical wisdom that transcends their historical moment, lessons about observation, persistence, and the courage to think differently, even when everyone around you insists you're wrong. If these tales of frontier innovation resonate with you, if you find value in preserving the memory of people like Thomas Morgan, who faced skepticism but trusted their observations anyway, consider subscribing to this channel and sharing these stories with others who appreciate that kind of determined ingenuity. Leave a comment if you know similar stories from your own family history or regional folklore, accounts of people who solved problems through innovation rather than convention. These narratives form a collective memory of human adaptability and practical wisdom that deserves to continue. Every share, every subscription helps ensure that the legacy of frontier problem solvers isn't lost to time, that their hard-won knowledge continues to inspire us to question, observe and innovate in our own lives. Thomas Morgan's Sideways Chimney reminds us that warmth often comes not from burning more, but from wasting less, and that the willingness to build differently, even alone, even mocked, can mean the difference between merely surviving and actually living well.